Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 7th chapter. Soon afterwards, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow, and with her was a large crowd from the town. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized all of them, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has looked favorably on his people." This word about him spread throughout Judea and all the surrounding country. The Gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. So the way the schedule worked out this week, you've got me preaching 2 weeks in a row, which is warming you up for July, when, as you may remember, you'll have me preaching for 3 weeks in a row. So get ready, 9:30. Hopefully by July it'll also be warmer, or at least more consistently drier. We have 2 large crowds in our story today. We have a crowd that is following the funeral procession of a widow's only son. A crowd that is consumed by death. And then we have a crowd that's following Jesus and has just seen him perform miracles of life. Miracles like the healing of the centurion's slave, that centurion who was an outsider of Israel, the healing of his slave from a distance, which we heard about last week. You know, death makes the news a lot, especially the tragic death such as that of a widow's only son. Just this week, I sat in my living room horrified at stories about death, stories like those of boats full of refugees crossing the sea trying to escape persecution, stories like those of soldiers swept away by floodwaters. But death comes in other forms, too. There is death that comes from fear, a fear that would keep us in our graves before we get there, fear of the unknown, fear of the unexperienced, fear that seems to permeate the airwaves these days, fear that would have us put up walls between each other, whether those walls are visible or invisible. I really struggle with Jesus this morning when he says to this woman, "Do not weep." As we would say in seminary, right, Pastor Kyle, that is not a very pastoral response. How can you say, "Do not weep," to someone who has lost so much? How can you say that to us? But then you also notice that Jesus has compassion for this woman. The new Stephen ministers, who we will recognize today, having completed hours of training, join a group of Stephen ministers who devote of their time and their skills and ministry of compassionate care to their care receivers, many of whom are also members of this congregation. And we give thanks for the great blessing of their devotion of time and their devotion of care among us. I was blessed to get to go and talk about myself in front of the Stephen ministers a few weeks ago, and I told them a few stories about my life before I started seminary for their continuing education program. And when I was finished, Mrs. Sharon Bartels came up to me and she said, "Anna, you didn't tell us anything about working in the hospital." And I said, "That's a good point, Sharon." Though that's experience happened during the first year of seminary, after I finished my first year. So even though it wasn't before I started seminary, my summer as a hospital chaplain at Mount Sinai Hospital in West Chicago was indeed one of the most influential pieces of my formation and education so far. So at the beginning of the year, in my very first sermon at Calvary, I told you about one of my worst nights on call at the hospital. And today, I'm going to tell you about the other one. So it was 4:30 in the afternoon, and I was getting ready for the on-call shift. And Chaplain Karen, the chaplain who had been on call during the day, came up to me. And she said, "There is a mother and her 20-year-old son in the hospital emergency room, and they're going to need pastoral care." The son, Michael, was autistic and had suddenly gotten very sick. His mother was in the waiting room, so I went down to sit with her and pray with her, and eventually we were transferred to the critical intensive care unit. Michael's heart had failed a few times before we were transferred, and while it all came on very suddenly, we would later learn that he had probably had some sort of undiagnosed diabetes or disease, and all of his systems had suddenly begun to fail. When we got to the ICU room, Michael's mother set up some of his favorite stuffed animals along the window ledge that his brother, her other son, had brought to her. Though Michael was unresponsive at this point and connected to many tubes, she talked to him and sang to him as though he could hear her, and maybe he did. Throughout the evening and into the night, doctors and nurses came up to talk to her to do their best to explain what was going on. And I was blessed to witness a compassionate team of medical professionals that night. But there was one nurse whose compassion stood out above the rest. One nurse who was not even assigned to care for Michael and his family. It was this nurse who, when Michael's heart began to fail again around midnight, put her arm around his mother as she was weeping and shaking and having a hard time breathing. It was this nurse who looked at me, a novice chaplain intern, crouched next to them, and said, "You're shaking too, chaplain. Go get yourself some juice from our refrigerator, one for her and one for you." It was this nurse who, when Michael had died, continued to hold on to his mother as she wailed in grief. And it was this nurse who wheeled Michael's mother, eventually shocked and stunned into grief and silence, into the waiting room, and came out of that waiting room, looked at me, opened her arms, and began to weep herself. I think maybe sometimes when it sounds like we're saying, "Do not weep," this weeping that we do when no one's looking shows the same kind of compassion that Jesus shows to this widow, because after all, Jesus knows suffering. Jesus knows weeping. So by 3:30 in the morning, when we wheeled Michael's mother and walked along with her sister and her other son down to their car, we were all too exhausted to weep anymore. The nurse and I got back on the elevator and we hugged one more time before getting off on our separate floors. And I went back to that on-call room, to write the last of my notes, and to lie on the bed for a few hours, knowing that it would be many hours before I could even begin to understand and process everything that I had experienced that night. So many hours that I'm still doing it today. The next day, Chaplain Karen came back for the on-call day shift. And she ended up providing pastoral care to Michael's family again, as they eventually decided to have Michael's organs donated, to give someone else the gift of new life. She wrote me one of the nicest emails I've ever gotten that afternoon. And in it, she said, "We shared the ministry of a woman whose love teaches compassion and sacrifice. Though she is wounded," Chaplain Karen wrote, "she will rise to the occasion and continue to love without condition." A few days later, I nominated the nurse whose compassion had amazed me to our Nurse of the Month award. And a few months later, when I was back in school, my supervisor called me to tell me that she had gotten the award. And he described how he had represented me and the pastoral care department, and along with the hospital administration had gone up to her floor to surprise her. And he described how happy she had been to receive those flowers, that award, and that certificate. One person can make a difference. We all make a difference, interconnected in each other's lives. Michael brought joy to his mother. That night in the ICU, his mother showed us the deepest depths of a mother's love. The nurse, whose compassion extended beyond the boundaries of her job, showed a powerful testimony of love to her on-call chaplain and to a grieving family. And because I spoke up, this nurse was recognized, awarded, and publicly thanked for her compassion. When we rise, when we sit up and begin to speak about the life that we know, the life that we know in the face of death, two large crowds become one. Fear may seize all of them, but also amazement, and God is glorified. Weeping may come in the night, and some nights are longer than others. But joy comes in the morning. A morning where grief and loss and pain and death are no more. So I say to you, church, I say to you, Stephen ministers, I say to you, day campers and disciple campers and counselors and leadership, I say to you, church, rise, sit up, and begin to speak of the life that you see in others, the new life that you know through the compassionate love of Jesus Christ, the great prophet risen among us. The word will spread. Amen.